what a difficult project this was, but it really turned out great. Stick around. So to begin with, I had this second block of spalted maple, and this chunk seemed to be near the root, so it's got some burl and some swirl in the grain. And it's more than 6 inches thick and probably 9 inches in diameter. And before I thought about putting this on the lathe, I really needed to cut this down. So I built set up a circle cutting jig and put a nail right in the center of this thing, which fits into a screw hole, and it allows me to cut it into pretty close to a circle. And then I had some fun with the cutoffs. And so the other thing I want to do is I'm going to attempt to put in some walnut dowels in 6 different equally spaced locations around this block. So essentially I measured them out at 60 degrees all the way around the circle. I also put a sacrificial little block of wood here to give me some room to put the mounting plate on, but then also when I cut into the block, I had room where that sacrificial block was to finish out the base without having to give up too much material. So I've actually got some old antique lathe chisels, but I really like using these carbide tip chisels for cutting into hardwood. And you've got to wear a full face shield because you're definitely going to get hit in the face with these shavings. So protection always. Now you can see that the blank isn't round, so I had to spend a little bit of time trying to cut it into a smooth cylinder. And that's our starting point before we even try drilling out the dowels. And man, you are definitely going to get messy. So now it's a smooth cylinder, and I want to measure out as equally as I can where I want to drill in these dowels. And I talked about this being difficult and impossible, or nearly impossible, but trying to drill these 1-inch holes for my 1-inch walnut dowels was a major pain in the rump. Now, my drill press only has a throw of about 3.5 inches, so even with an extension on my Forstner bit, I can only take the drill bit down so far. In order to get it all the way through, I had to move the table up on the drill press and then try to move the Forstner bit farther down into the material, and that didn't work because I couldn't lift the Forstner bit all the way up and clear out the holes, so it got stuck. I was forced to try to do this manually with the Forstner bit and the extension, and it was really difficult to try to keep the drill bit in the center of the hole. In fact, they were not perfectly straight down. This was almost a disaster. So I was able to get through all these holes, but they weren't straight. Then I had to go to the store and buy a 1-inch auger bit to try to round out and smooth out those holes so that I could hammer in the dowels. And this was not an exact science. It was making all kinds of noise, actually started smoking in a couple of holes, and I knew I was going to have trouble actually pounding in these dowels. So the last thing I did was I put together a little makeshift sanding rod that I could fit in my drill and did the best I could to try to get these holes squared away, straight up and down and smooth, so that I could pound in the dowels with some glue. Now in this particular case, I'm using one of my favorite tricks, just 1/2 of a pair of chopsticks, to get the glue in the hole. And then I kind of went nuts making sure that the actual dowel was really wet with glue. It's as much of a lubricant as you can find before you hammer these things in. And I expected it to be difficult, but I really had to go hard on the hammer to get these things down in the holes. In fact, it did wind up cracking a couple of the holes from the pressure. There was just nothing I could do about that. And for a couple of pieces that did crack, I had to reinforce it with some CA glue just to hopefully keep the wood together when I put it back on the lathe. And so now that all this stuff is dry, I'm just going to cut off the extra pieces on the top here. And so the fun thing about working with a lathe is you don't really know what the wood is going to look like until you start to cut into it. And I've seen so many other really great YouTube channels out there, especially the guys that do wood turning, will say the same thing. You have an idea of what you'd want to create, but you don't really know what it's going to look like until you start digging into the grain. And I wanted to save some of the spalting, those black lines that you're going to see in the wood, and incorporate those into the finished product. I didn't want to cut them all out. I wanted to keep some of that for interest in the piece. And then it occurred to me that I like the idea of maybe creating a tulip shape, or what's known as a tulip bowl, and it just has that lip at the very top of the bowl that's curved in and then curved out. And so as it turns out, as I was cutting this down, it really started to look good, just like this. I actually kind of like the look of that right now. So there's enough of the walnut showing through, some of the black spalting, and there's enough of a tulip edge here for me to start cutting on the inside. I might make this a little bit more round. This is kind of flat right here, but after a little bit of tuning, I'll be able to start working on the inside. So to save a little pain and agony, I got my biggest Forstner bit and was able to drive this down the center and take out a lot of material that otherwise you'd have to pull out with the chisels. So this took a while. It also got hot. I had to pull the bit out and let it cool down. You don't want to start a fire in your basement, but it came close to that. And the shavings really started to pile up. Now, of course, this takes a while, and putting it on high speed helps with the video anyway. This is maybe the most satisfying part of cutting anything on the lathe. It's really interesting to watch the chisel dig through the material and make a nice smooth cut. And the other thing that I needed to do, because this was spalted maple, and that meant that where the spalting lines are, the wood is just not as firm. I didn't want to cut this bowl too thin. I wanted to avoid the risk of having this thing fly apart on the lathe. So I left it about 3/8 of an inch thick, which is a little bit thicker than you would normally do for a decorative bowl. But I didn't want to go any thinner than that because of the spalting, and like I had mentioned, there were a couple of cracks in the material from driving in those dowels. So the CA glue helped firm up those cracks, but I really didn't want to go any thinner than that. And so quite a bit of sanding. I used 60 grit paper here to finish out the shaping, and then worked it all the way down to 400 grit, and then 600 grit was my last pass on this bowl. finally I just flattened the base, got it cut in as deeply as I could, and then I'll cut the bowl off. So I was worried, really, throughout the entire project about whether or not I could get the dowels down. I tried to get them as perfectly straight as I could, and did pretty well, but really worrisome and trying to drive those 1-inch dowels through the bowl without having it completely break apart. And for the finish, I just used gloss lacquer, which was similar to what I used on the sister bowl, which I'll show you at the very end. And so this thing really looks great. The inside of the bowl is just wonderful. With a little bit of that walnut peeking out at the bottom of the bowl, turns out to be a great little fruit bowl. And you can see, because the burl sits pretty close to the stump, all the color in the grain. And this is the sister bowl that I did last year. Really great color on this. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this week's video. And as always, if you like our content, we hope you give us a thumbs up, you subscribe to the channel, and if you hit the bell icon, you'll get notified every time we publish something new. Take care.